John Sterling had successfully orchestrated a $10 billion hostile takeover the week before, but as he sat in seat 1A surrounded by the wreckage of first class, spilled formula soaking into leather armrests, $3,000 noise-canceling headphones completely useless against the assault, he realized he was being utterly defeated by three tiny humans who didn't care about his net worth. 4 hours and 17 minutes. Triplets Leo, Maya, and Sam had screamed in perfect, devastating harmony aboard the Boeing 777 to Zurich. John Sterling had tried everything a man with unlimited resources could attempt at 38,000 feet. He'd cycled through every bottle, every pacifier, every toy the flight attendants could produce from the galley. He'd walked the first-class cabin until his arms burned, bouncing one infant while the other two wailed in their bassinets. He'd even attempted to hire the flight attendants on the spot to take over, offering obscene amounts of money, but they'd politely declined with tight-lipped smiles. The other passengers had stopped being polite an hour ago. A hedge fund manager in 2C had complained to the crew twice. A Silicon Valley CEO's wife had requested a seat change with an audible huff. Even the lead flight attendant had approached with that carefully diplomatic expression that meant we're going to have to do something about this. John's dress shirt, Tom Ford, $800, was stained with spit-up and desperation. His bloodshot eyes burned from grief, exhaustion, and the crushing realization that all his billions couldn't buy him 5 minutes of peace. Not since Sarah died. Not since he'd become a single father to 3 10-month-olds who seemed to sense his terror and helplessness. That's when he saw her. A small black girl, maybe 10 years old, emerged through the first-class curtain like she'd crossed an invisible border. Her clothes were clean but obviously worn, her sneakers scuffed, and she clutched a battered violin case covered in travel stickers to her chest. She moved with the kind of careful determination that children develop when they're used to not belonging in spaces like this. She stopped at the edge of John's row, her dark eyes taking in the chaos, the screaming triplets, the exhausted billionaire, the judging passengers pretending not to stare. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice somehow cutting through the cacophony. "May I try something?" John looked up at her, too broken to question why a child from economy was offering help. A flight attendant was already moving toward them, ready to escort the girl back, but John held up his hand. "Please," he croaked. "I don't care who you are. If you can help, do it." The girl set down her violin case and stepped closer to Leo, who was leading the trio's crying symphony. She didn't reach for him immediately. Instead, she began to hum, a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate from somewhere deep in her chest. It wasn't a typical lullaby. It was older than that, rhythmic and hypnotic, like the pulse of the earth itself. Then she began tapping. Her small fingers created a specific pattern on the side of Leo's car seat. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. A rhythm that matched the humming, that seemed to sync with something primal. Leo's screaming stuttered, hiccuped, slowed. The entire first-class cabin fell into breathless silence as 200 passengers throughout the plane seemed to collectively hold their breath. Maya and Sam, as if sensing their brother's shift, began to quiet too. Within 90 seconds, John would later swear on his life, it was exactly 90 seconds. All three babies had fallen into the kind of deep, peaceful sleep that John hadn't witnessed since before his wife's death. The girl continued her humming and tapping for another minute, then slowly, carefully withdrew her hands. The silence held. The babies breathed steadily, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect synchronization. John stared at her, this impossible child who'd accomplished what nannies, pediatricians, and a grief-stricken billionaire father could not. "How did you?" he whispered, his voice catching. "Who taught you that?" The girl picked up her violin case, suddenly looking shy now that the emergency had passed. "My great-grandmother," she said softly. "She said all babies remember the first songs, the ones from before words. You just have to help them remember too." Emily had been watching from seat 38B for the past hour, her fingers pressed against her ears as the crying echoed through the entire aircraft. She'd seen the flight attendants disappear behind the first-class curtain multiple times, their expressions growing more strained each time they returned. She'd heard the whispered complaints from passengers around her, the sighs of frustration, the muttered curses. But what she'd mostly heard was something else beneath the baby's screams, a kind of desperation that reminded her of the stray cats back in her neighborhood, The ones who cried because they'd been abandoned and didn't understand why no one was coming. Her great-grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. When you hear pain like that, baby girl, and you know you can help, you help. Doesn't matter if they're rich or poor, black or white. Pain is pain. Emily unbuckled her seatbelt before she could talk herself out of it. She grabbed her violin case. She never went anywhere without it, and started the long walk forward. Past the economy passengers who barely noticed her. Past the premium economy section where a businessman glanced up from his laptop with mild curiosity. Past the galley where a flight attendant was making coffee with the desperate intensity of someone trying to drown out noise. Then she reached it. The curtain. The thick navy fabric barrier that separated the world into those who belonged and those who didn't. Emily had never been past this curtain in her life. Every flight she'd ever taken, which wasn't many, she'd stayed in her assigned seat, grateful just to be on a plane at all. Her hand trembled slightly as she pushed the fabric aside. First class was chaos wrapped in luxury. The leather seats, the extra space, the tiny warm towels on a tray. None of it mattered when 3 babies were screaming loud enough to crack crystal. A woman in pearls had her fingers pressed to her temples. A man in an expensive suit was aggressively typing on his phone, probably complaining to someone who could do absolutely nothing about it. And in seat 1A was the most exhausted man Emily had ever seen. His shirt was stained, his hair disheveled, and he was staring at the 3 car seats in front of him like they contained some unsolvable equation. 2 flight attendants flanked him, speaking in low, urgent tones. One was holding a bottle. The other had her hand on his shoulder in what was probably meant to be a comforting gesture, but looked more like she was trying to keep him from completely falling apart. Emily walked straight toward them, her worn sneakers silent on the carpeted aisle. One of the flight attendants noticed her first. "Sweetie, you can't be up here. Economy is." "Please," Emily said, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. She looked directly at the exhausted man, at the grief in his bloodshot eyes, at the way he was holding himself together with nothing but willpower and whatever fumes remained of his strength. "Sir, may I hold him?" The one crying the loudest. The man, John Sterling, though Emily didn't know his name yet, looked up at her. For a moment, she thought he might say no, might let the flight attendants escort her back where she belonged. Then he simply nodded and whispered one word that sounded like both permission and prayer. "Please." Emily set her violin case down carefully beside seat 1A and stepped closer to the car seat, holding Leo. The baby's face was purple-red, his mouth open in a wail that seemed impossible for such a tiny body to produce. His fists were clenched, his entire body rigid with whatever distress had consumed him for the past 4 hours. She didn't reach for him immediately. That was the first rule her great-grandmother had taught her. Never grab at pain. You invite it to quiet down first. Emily closed her eyes and began to hum. The sound started deep in her chest, lower than most people expected from a 10-year-old girl. It wasn't a melody exactly, more like a vibration, a resonance that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and instinctive. Her great-grandmother had called it the first sound, the one that existed before language, before music, before anything except the rhythm of a heartbeat and the warmth of being held. One of the flight attendants started to interrupt, but John held up his hand, his exhausted eyes fixed on Emily with something between desperation and hope. Emily's humming continued, steady and unbroken, as she leaned closer to Leo's car seat. Then she began the tapping, her small fingers creating a specific pattern against the hard plastic side of the seat. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. The rhythm matched her humming, created a synchronization that was almost hypnotic. Leo's screaming wavered, stuttered. His purple face began to lose some of its intensity. Emily kept going, her eyes still closed, her whole body focused on creating this pocket of calm in the chaos. She'd done this dozens of times back home. For colicky babies in her apartment building, for her cousin's twins, for the neighbor's newborn who cried every night until Emily's great-grandmother sent her over with instructions to sing him back to peace. But she'd never done it on an airplane, never done it surrounded by wealthy strangers who were watching her like she was performing some kind of miracle instead of just remembering what her great-grandmother's hands had taught her. The humming shifted slightly, found a deeper frequency. The tapping pattern adjusted. 1, 2, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. Responding to something Emily could sense in the baby's breathing, in the way his small body was beginning to relax. Maya stopped crying next. Then Sam. The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that Emily could hear the soft whisper of the air circulation system, the distant beep of something electronic in the cockpit, the sharp inhale of the woman in pearls who'd been pressing her temples. Emily opened her eyes. All three babies were staring at her with that unfocused infant gaze that seemed to see everything and nothing at once. Leo's fists had uncurled. His breathing had steadied into the soft, rhythmic pattern of approaching sleep. She continued the humming and tapping for another minute, letting the calm settle into their small bodies like a blanket. Then, slowly, she withdrew her hands and let the humming fade into silence. The babies slept. The entire first-class cabin exhaled. John stared at the sleeping babies, then at the small girl standing beside his seat, then back at the babies, as if trying to convince himself that what had just happened was real. The silence felt fragile, like glass that might shatter if anyone spoke too loudly or moved too quickly. "I don't understand," he whispered finally, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "How did you do that?" Emily shrugged, suddenly looking very much like the 10-year-old she was, shy and uncertain now that the emergency had passed. "My great-grandmother taught me. She said babies remember sounds from before they were born. You just have to help them find it again." John gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Please, sit. I need to." He stopped, realizing he didn't know what he needed except to not let this child disappear back through that curtain without understanding what had just happened. "What's your name?" "Emily." She glanced at the flight attendants, who were still hovering nearby with expressions of stunned disbelief, then carefully sat down. Her violin case stayed clutched in her lap like a shield. "I'm John." He looked at her properly now, taking in the worn clothes that had been carefully maintained, the sneakers that were at least a size too small, the violin case covered in travel stickers from places that seemed impossible for a child to have visited. "Are you traveling with family?" "No, sir. Just me." Emily's fingers traced one of the stickers, a faded image of the Eiffel Tower. "I'm going to Zurich for an audition. At the Conservatory of Music." John's business instincts kicked in despite his exhaustion. A 10-year-old traveling internationally alone to a prestigious conservatory audition. That meant either extraordinary talent or extraordinary desperation. Probably both. That's quite an accomplishment. Getting an audition there, I mean. Emily's face brightened slightly. "They heard a recording my music teacher submitted. She said it was a miracle they even listened to it, but they did, and they invited me to audition in person." Her smile faded a little. "My mama and my aunt sold almost everything to buy this ticket. It's called a hardship scholarship audition, for kids who can't afford the normal application process." John noticed how tightly she was holding the violin case, how her entire body seemed to curve protectively around it. "May I see your violin?" She hesitated, then slowly opened the case. Inside was an instrument that made John, who knew nothing about violins, wince. The wood was scratched and dull. There was a visible crack along the side that had been carefully glued back together. The bow looked like it might snap if handled too firmly. But the inside of the case was immaculate, lined with a soft cloth that had been hand-sewn, and Emily touched the instrument with the kind of reverence most people reserved for holy objects. "She's not much," Emily said quietly, "but she's mine. My great-grandmother's, actually. She played it in church for 50 years before she gave it to me." John looked at this small girl with her broken violin and her impossible talent, and felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut since Sarah's funeral. John found himself staring at the cracked violin with an intensity that surprised him. He'd spent the last 3 months moving through life in a fog of grief and corporate obligations, making billion-dollar decisions while simultaneously forgetting to eat, to sleep, to do anything except survive. But sitting here in the artificial quiet of the cabin, watching his 3 children sleep peacefully for the first time in what felt like forever, something was shifting inside him. "Your family sold everything for this ticket?" he asked, hearing the weight of those words properly for the first time. Emily nodded, carefully closing the violin case. "Mama's wedding ring. Aunt Keisha's car. Well, she sold it to her cousin, so it's still kind of in the family. And they did extra shifts at work for 3 months. Mama works at the hospital cafeteria, and Aunt Keisha cleans offices downtown." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but John could hear what she wasn't saying. "This is my one shot. If I fail, it was all for nothing." John thought about the plane ticket he'd purchased without a second thought. First-class seats for himself and 3-car seats for infants who couldn't possibly appreciate the extra legroom. It had cost more than most people made in a month, and he'd barely glanced at the receipt. Meanwhile, Emily's family had dismantled their entire financial security for a single economy seat and a chance. "When's your audition?" he asked. "Tomorrow afternoon. 2 o'clock. Emily's fingers traced the edges of her violin case. "I'm supposed to take a train from the airport to the conservatory, then perform for the selection committee. If they like what they hear, I get a full scholarship. Room, board, instruction, everything. My teacher says I could be the youngest American student they've ever accepted. And if they don't?" Emily's expression flickered, just for a moment, revealing the fear beneath her careful composure. "Then I go home and hope my family doesn't hate me for wasting everything they sacrificed." John felt something uncomfortably close to shame. He'd been so consumed by his own grief, his own struggles, that he'd forgotten there were people fighting battles that made his problems look like minor inconveniences. Yes, he'd lost Sarah. Yes, single fatherhood with triplets was overwhelming. But he had resources. He had options. He had a safety net woven from money and privilege that meant failure would never be catastrophic. Emily had none of that. She had a broken violin, a plane ticket purchased with wedding rings and sold cars, and a talent that might be her only way out of poverty. "You gave me something tonight," John said quietly, glancing at his sleeping children. "The first peace I've had since my wife died. The first moment where I felt like maybe I could actually do this, be their father without her." He turned to look at Emily directly. "That's not something I can repay with money, but—" "I don't want money, sir," Emily interrupted softly. "I just wanted to help." The babies sounded so sad. John smiled. A real smile, the first in months. "I know, but I'm going to help you anyway." He pulled out his phone. "What hotel are you staying at in Zurich?" Emily looked down at her lap. "I'm not. The return flight is tomorrow night. I'll sleep in the airport if I have to." John felt that crack in his chest widen further. "Not anymore," he said. "You're not." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom 30 minutes later, flat and professional in that way that meant something serious was coming. "Flight attendants, please take your seats immediately. We're encountering some unexpected turbulence. All passengers should remain seated with seatbelts fastened." John had barely finished processing the announcement when the plane dropped. Not a gentle dip, but a sickening plunge that left his stomach somewhere above his head. Oxygen masks dangled from the ceiling like yellow ghosts. The cabin lights flickered. Someone screamed in economy. Leo's eyes snapped open. Maya started to whimper. John's hands moved on instinct, reaching for the babies, his heart hammering with the same panic that was spreading through the cabin. This was it. The moment they'd start screaming again. The moment the fragile peace would shatter, and he'd be right back where he started. Helpless, desperate, defeated. But Emily was faster. She unbuckled her seatbelt, ignoring the flight attendant's sharp, "Miss, stay seated," and positioned herself where she could see all 3-car seats. The plane shuddered again, tilting at an angle that made the overhead bins groan. Thunder cracked somewhere outside, loud enough to feel in their bones. "Look," Emily said, her voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected steadiness. She pointed at the window where lightning was illuminating the darkness beyond. "Do you see that? That's the stars dancing. My great-grandmother told me that when storms come, the stars get so excited they can't help but dance around. That's what makes the lightning. It's just their joy getting too big to hold inside." John stared at her, incredulous. The plane was being tossed around like a toy. Passengers were gripping their armrests with white knuckles, and this 10-year-old was telling the babies a story about dancing stars. But Leo wasn't crying. His wide eyes were fixed on Emily's face, tracking her words like they were a lifeline. "And the thunder?" Emily continued, her hands moving in gentle gestures that somehow made the violent shaking seem less terrifying. "That's just the stars laughing. They're having such a good time up there, jumping from cloud to cloud, that they can't help but laugh real loud." Boom. She clapped her hands softly with the next crack of thunder. "Hear that? That's them saying we," as they slide down the rainbows. Maya had stopped whimpering. Sam was watching Emily with that intense infant focus that usually preceded either crying or sleeping. The plane dropped again, harder this time, and John's breath caught in his throat. But Emily just smiled and leaned closer to the babies. "Ooh, that was a big jump. The stars must be playing leapfrog now." My great-grandmother used to say that when you're up this high, you're in their playground. They're just being friendly, showing us their games. John watched her transform terror into wonder with nothing but words and presence. No equipment, no money, no control over the weather or the plane or anything physical at all. Just her voice, her calm, her absolute certainty that fear was a choice and comfort was something you could create from thin air. The baby stayed quiet through 15 more minutes of turbulence. And John realized he'd been parenting wrong this entire time. The Zurich airport was all glass and efficient Swiss precision, a stark contrast to the chaos they'd left behind in the air. John had arranged for a car service and a suite at the Bowerow Lac for Emily, over her protests, and was in the middle of explaining to a ground crew member about expediting their luggage when he heard it. A sound that was somehow worse than the baby's crying. A kind of choked gasp that came from pure devastation. He turned to see Emily standing at the luggage carousel, her hands pressed to her mouth, staring down at something on the floor. John wheeled the triple stroller over quickly, his heart already sinking because he knew. He just knew what had happened. The violin case lay on the industrial tile, split open like a broken shell. It must have been caught between two heavy suitcases on the carousel, crushed by the weight of someone's carelessness and the indifferent machinery of travel. The travel stickers that Emily had traced so lovingly on the plane were torn and scattered. The hand-sewn cloth lining was visible through the cracked plastic. And the violin itself. John had seen enough broken things in his life to recognize when something was beyond repair. The neck had snapped cleanly where it met the body. Strings hung loose like severed nerves. The careful glue work that had held together the previous crack had given way, and now the instrument looked less like a violin and more like kindling. Emily dropped to her knees, her hands hovering over the pieces as if touching them might make the damage more real. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no, please." John crouched beside her, one hand on the stroller to keep the baby steady. He wanted to say something comforting, something that would fix this, but his mind was spinning through logistics instead of sympathy. How quickly could he get a replacement? There had to be music shops in Zurich. He could buy out an entire store if necessary. Money could fix this. Money could fix anything. "My audition is tomorrow," Emily said, her voice breaking on the last word. She picked up a piece of the violin, just a splinter of wood, really, and held it like it was made of glass. "I can't audition without an instrument. They don't provide them. You have to bring your own." "We'll get you another one," John said immediately. "There are music stores here. I'll buy you the best violin in Switzerland if that's what it takes." But Emily was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face now. "You don't understand. This was my great-grandmother's violin. She played it for 50 years. My mama said it still had her music inside it, that when I played, I was playing with her spirit." She looked up at John with eyes that held more grief than any 10-year-old should carry. "How do I audition without her? How do I play alone?" John looked down at the destroyed instrument, at this child who'd saved his sanity on the plane with nothing but her presence and her gift, and realized that for the first time in his life, he was facing a problem that money might not be able to solve. But he was damn well going to try. John made 3 phone calls while Emily sat in the back of the Mercedes, still holding pieces of her great-grandmother's violin like sacred relics. The first call was to his executive assistant in New York, who didn't question why her boss was demanding the name and contact information for the finest luthier in Zurich at 11 o'clock at night. The second was to his private banker in Geneva, authorizing a transfer that made even the banker pause before confirming the amount. The third was to Matteo Cavalli, master luthier, whose workshop had been serving the Zurich Philharmonic and Conservatory for 3 generations. "Mr. Cavalli doesn't open until 9, his assistant had reported back. "He's opening now," John had replied. "Tell him I'll pay for his time. Whatever he wants." 20 minutes later, the car pulled up to a narrow street in Zurich's Old Town, where a small shop with hand-painted gold lettering stood dark except for a single light that had just flickered on in the back. John lifted Leo's car seat with one hand and offered Emily his other. She took it hesitantly, still clutching the broken pieces. The door opened before they could knock. Matteo Cavalli was a man in his 70s with silver hair and hands that looked like they'd spent a lifetime coaxing beauty from wood. He took one look at John, the sleeping triplets, and Emily's tear-stained face, and simply stepped aside. "Come," he said in accented English. "Let me see what has broken." The workshop smelled of wood shavings, varnish, and and something deeper, the accumulated scent of centuries of craftsmanship. Violins hung on the walls like art in a gallery, each one more beautiful than the last. Emily's eyes widened as she took in the space, her grief momentarily forgotten in the face of such wonder. Matteo examined the broken violin under a bright lamp, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up at Emily. "Your great-grandmother's?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "She was loved, this instrument. I can see it in how she was maintained." He touched one of the broken pieces gently. "But she has given all she can give. Her music lives now in you, child, not in the wood." Emily's lower lip trembled. Matteo stood and gestured to the walls. "So, we find you a new vessel for that music." "Yes." He glanced at John. "Mr. Sterling has been very generous with his time constraints. I have perhaps 30 instruments here that would be suitable for a conservatory audition." "She can try them all," John said. "As many as she needs." "No," Matteo corrected gently. "She will try until she finds the one that speaks to her. That is how it works. The violin chooses the musician as much as the musician chooses the violin." For the next 45 minutes, Emily played. She started tentatively, drawing the bow across strings that cost more than her family's monthly rent, but slowly her confidence returned. Each violin had a different voice, some bright and sharp, others warm and mellow. John sat in a corner with the sleeping triplets and watched this small girl test instruments that cost more than cars, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of value. Finally, Emily lifted a violin that Matteo identified as a 19th century Italian piece, maker unknown, but the craftsmanship evident in every curve. She drew the bow across the strings and closed her eyes. The sound that filled the workshop was transcendent. "That one," she whispered. "It sounds like home." The Zurich Conservatory of Music auditorium was smaller than John had expected, intimate and acoustically perfect, with dark wood paneling and rows of seats that curved toward a simple raised platform. The selection committee sat in the front row, for people with notebooks and decades of musical expertise written in the lines of their faces. John had positioned himself in the very last row with the triple stroller, far enough away that if the babies started crying, he could make a quick exit without disrupting the audition. Leo was chewing on a pacifier. Maya was asleep. Sam was staring at the ceiling with that glazed infant expression that could go either peaceful or catastrophic without warning. Emily walked onto the platform carrying the 19th century Italian violin like it was made of light. She wore the same worn clothes from the plane. John had offered to buy her an outfit, but she'd refused, saying her mama had pressed these clothes special for the audition and it would be disrespectful to wear something else. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and in the stage lighting, she looked simultaneously much younger than 10 and infinitely older. She adjusted the shoulder rest, tested the tuning with a few quick plucks, then looked up at the committee. "My name is Emily Richardson," she said, her voice small but steady. "I'm going to play Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor, the chaconne." One of the committee members, a severe-looking woman with steel-gray hair, raised an eyebrow. The chaconne was notoriously difficult, a piece that challenged even professional violinists. For a 10-year-old to attempt it at an audition was either breathtaking confidence or devastating hubris. Emily closed her eyes, took a breath, and began. The first notes emerged clean and precise, technically perfect, but somewhat cautious. John found himself holding his own breath, his hands gripping the stroller handle. But then, about 30 seconds in, something shifted. Emily's body relaxed. Her bow arm found a fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone so young. And the music? The music stopped being notes on a page and became something alive. John had attended charity galas where famous violinists performed. He'd heard recordings of the world's greatest musicians, but he'd never heard anything like this. Emily wasn't just playing Bach. She was translating grief and hope and resilience into sound. Every phrase carried the weight of her great-grandmother's 50 years in church pews, her mother's sacrificed wedding ring, her family's impossible faith in a 10-year-old's dream. The severe committee member's expression softened. Another leaned forward, his notebook forgotten. Leo stopped chewing his pacifier. Even the babies seemed to sense that something important was happening. Emily moved through the piece's technical challenges like they were conversations she was having with the composer himself. The rapid string crossings, the demanding double stops, the emotional crescendos that required both physical stamina and spiritual depth. when she reached the final resolution. That moment where Bach brings the listener back to earth after 15 minutes of transcendence. There were tears on her cheeks, but her bow remained steady. The last note hung in the air for a breathless moment before fading into silence. The committee sat frozen. John realized his own face was wet. Then the steel-haired woman stood, and the entire committee followed. They weren't just clapping. They were giving a 10-year-old girl from economy class a standing ovation. Emily opened her eyes, saw them standing, and smiled. Not the careful, polite smile she'd worn on the plane, but something radiant and unguarded and full of the pure joy of having been truly heard. The committee's decision came within an hour. Full scholarship, room and board, private instruction with the conservatory's most distinguished professors. They'd never seen talent like this, they told Emily, especially not in someone so young and from such humble circumstances. She would begin in the fall term, giving her time to arrange her life, say goodbye to her family, and prepare for the intensity of conservatory training. Emily had called her mother from the conservatory's office, and John had listened to her barely coherent joy through the phone. "Mama, I did it, I really did it," and heard the answering sobs of relief from a woman who'd bet everything on her daughter's impossible dream and won. But John wasn't done yet. 2 weeks after returning to San Francisco, he established the Hidden Genius Foundation with an initial endowment of $50 million. The mission was simple: identify and support extraordinarily talented children whose potential was being suffocated by poverty. Full scholarships, living expenses, equipment, travel costs, whatever it took to ensure that talent was never wasted simply because someone was born into the wrong economic circumstances. Emily Richardson was named as the foundation's inaugural scholar and the inspiration for its existence. Her photograph, holding that 19th-century Italian violin in Matteo Cavalli's workshop, became the foundation's first promotional material, along with a quote she'd given. "Everybody's got music inside them. Some people just need help letting it out." The foundation's announcement made headlines. Tech billionaire's encounter with musical prodigy on plane leads to major philanthropic initiative. John did exactly 3 interviews before deciding he hated talking about himself and delegated all media relations to his communications team. This wasn't about him. It was about the thousands of Emilys who never got their chance because no one was watching from seat 1A when their world fell apart. But the real change happened at home. John had fired the night nurses and the rotating nannies. Not because they were inadequate, but because he'd finally understood what Emily had shown him during the turbulence. Presence mattered more than perfection. He couldn't outsource connection. He couldn't hire someone to teach his children that their father was actually there, actually invested in their lives beyond providing material comfort. So now he did the 2 a.m. feedings himself. He sang to them, badly, but consistently. He told them stories about stars dancing in storms and music living inside people, and how sometimes the most important things in life came from unexpected places, like a 10-year-old girl from the back of a plane. Leo, Maya, and Sam would never remember the flight to Zurich. They'd never know about the 4 hours of screaming or the moment a stranger's humming changed everything. But John would remember. Every single day for the rest of his life, he would remember that the thing he needed most couldn't be bought or negotiated or acquired through hostile takeover. It could only be received, with gratitude, from someone who'd learned to give it freely. Want to read more stories about unexpected connections and life-changing encounters? Follow for new chapters and share this story with someone who believes in the power of kindness across all boundaries.